Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Building the Business Case to Build Sustainably. My name is Felix, and I'm the webinar coordinator at the Continuing Education Department here at the OAA. We will begin today's webinar by acknowledging the land on which we are meeting and calling in from today. For millennia, the place we call Ontario has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples and nations who have been stewards of the land and are deeply connected to its rich cultural and natural landscape. We would like to invite you in a moment of reflection to acknowledge our shared responsibility to address past and present injustices and provide space for Indigenous knowledge and worldviews to shape the architectural landscape of Turtle Island. Before we commence, I would like to share some important information to ensure an effective and professional webinar experience. Please be informed that this session is being recorded for quality and educational purposes. In order to maintain a stable internet connection, we have muted all participant microphones and disabled video feeds. We highly encourage engagement through our Q&A window. Feel free to submit any questions you may have for our speakers. These will be addressed in the designated question and answer period at the end of the presentation. Kindly note that the chat function will be deactivated following this introduction. For those seeking continuing education learning hours, please note that attendance is crucial. A minimum of 80% attendance is required for these hours to be accredited to your OAA transcript. Please allow up to a few weeks for the processing and reporting of these hours. And lastly, please note that the presenters do not provide insurance, legal, or practice advice, and the OAA does not bear responsibility for errors or omissions in discussions during the webinar. For accessibility, we provide automated closed captioning service available in multiple languages to accommodate the needs of our diverse audience. But now, I'm excited to introduce you to our speakers for today's session. Please welcome Peter Duckworth and Jeff Mosher. Peter has over 25 years of experience gained on projects as diverse as townhouses to corporate campuses and master planning of entire urban precincts. As project architect and sustainability lead, he has overseen the design of more than 20 LEED certified schools, community centers, libraries, high-performance sport venues, university buildings, and high-rise mixed-use developments. In an attempt to walk the talk, Peter is a four-session bicycle commuter and lives in the Green Laneway home he designed for his family. He has also lectured and written widely on the project of sustainable building. Jeff Mosher is a LEED and EDAC accredited professional with 15 years of industry experience, primarily focused on the design and construction of healthcare facilities. Member of the Canada Green Building Council and co-founder of a Permaculture Ottawa, Jeff's recent experience with integrated P3 project delivery on some of Ontario's largest healthcare infrastructure projects has given him unique insights into best practices in not just reducing the carbon footprint of our buildings, but in planning for climate resiliency to prepare for those changes that may be all but inevitable. Thanks for your attention. Let us now proceed with the session, and I'm passing it over to our speakers, Jeff and Peter.
Okay, thank you very much, Felix. And thank you everybody for joining us today. It's exciting to see this many people out to the webinar. I know end of cycle is coming. I'm facing that myself, so I'm sure a lot of people are eager to get the points, but it's great to see so many people interested in this topic. Thinking especially about, and I did ride in today, although it was not that much of a challenge. Might be some rain this afternoon. I'm in Toronto, but just, the variability that we're seeing in weather, and although that doesn't relate to climate, I think has certainly raised people's awareness of issues of climate change. So excited to see so many people on the call today to talk about some really pragmatic ways of incorporating climate change and more positive climate approaches in our architectural practice. Seeing a lot of familiar names in the chat, and certainly some excellent practitioners who have been doing some really important work around sustainable design and green design and climate positive design. So looking forward to the discussion today. I will start off the presentation, and I'll be handing it off to Jeff, and then I'll be coming back in as we get to the end. But just wanted to start off with the learning objectives here. So first of all, we want to describe the importance of the life cycle assessment. We want to talk about assessing sustainable design options using the life cycle assessment. And I realize that life cycle assessment might be new terminology for some people. It may be very old terminology for other people. So we'll kind of gauge in the seminar as we go through just people's familiarity with the terminology, but we will be defining these terms as we go along. Evaluate the use of life cycle assessments to support sustainable design measures. And I think this is key. I think we've all been at the other side of the table when we're suggesting sustainable design measures to a client, and we're told, well, look, I've only got a certain budget, and that's it. But a life cycle assessment is one of the key tools we can use to open up that conversation, to have a more meaningful conversation and open up some of the opportunities for implementing sustainable measures in our design. We also want to describe, the economic argument. And as I was mentioning, in a lot of cases, unfortunately, that is the argument for some clients about, of how to look at sustainable design and how it benefits them in a very pragmatic and dollars and cents kind of way. So that's a high level what we're talking about, what we'll be going through today. But so we're discussing a wide range of things. It is structured around the life cycle cost assessment, but talking about climate change, the cost of construction, doing the right thing versus what's sometimes perceived as the affordable thing. Talking about this idea of cost of ownership, and this is something that is really critical to clients, but often they kind of don't see necessarily. The cost of climate change as well, which is something that we don't always see. So much of our economic forecasting and modeling is based on previous practice, but we know that previous practice no longer applies in the climate change future that we're looking at. We want to look at how we use that life cycle cost analysis to time travel, to look at the future and what the future can reliably be predicted. And we want to talk about the way we need to change as a practice, the way we work with our clients, the way we work with our consultants. So first, Felix started off with a land acknowledgement. And one of the pieces of the land acknowledgement was how we think about Indigenous knowledge and how we apply that to our practice. And that's how I really want to think about this land acknowledgement. So this is the traditional land acknowledgement for the city of Toronto, where I'm speaking from. So obviously the traditional territory of the Mississaugas, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa and Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples, and now home to diverse group of First Nations. And in fact, Toronto has the largest Indigenous population in Canada of an urban center. Also to recognize that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13. And we won't get into that, but it's interesting what that means as there is a nation-to-nation relationship with the Mississaugas of the Credit as part of Toronto's landform. But I wanted to really delve into this idea of some of the Indigenous knowledge, because the other piece that we need to think about is that our lands traditionally were under the dish with one spoon agreement among those First Nations that we mentioned, the kind of original inhabitants of this land. And the dish with one spoon treaty, I think, is really interesting, and it really is foretold in a lot of ways some of the challenges that we're facing now. So the dish with one spoon, the idea is obviously the metaphor of the dish, that there's one dish that contains a finite amount of resources, and we all share that single dish. And there is only one spoon. So the idea is that we then share those resources equally. Everybody gets the same amount of sharing those resources. And this was an agreement that led to, sustainable inhabitation of these lands for millennia. And I think that's a very, these are really important concepts that we need to start rediscovering, relearning as settlers on this land as a way to sustainably live into the future. And certainly facing climate change, I think there's some very important lessons on the way this land was inhabited that we can apply to our continued survival as a civilization going forward. Particularly thinking from the Haudenosaunee tradition of thinking of the seventh generation values, that the actions that we take today, thinking about what those impacts are on our descendants, starting to think much more in long term than the short term. And the idea that, again, that we are borrowing this land from future generations, so that the decisions we make today, the constructions that we build today are going to be important to our future generations. And thinking about in a deep way how we think about the future. Again, as we talk about, a lot of our work as architects is focused on that tender value and maybe the value at the end of construction. And we're not thinking too much about what happens to our buildings after they're occupied and what are those costs ongoing. So thinking, again, widening that time horizon, thinking about those longer term issues is going to be critical and is a critical part of making the business case for sustainable design. So first of all, just a word about sustainability. It's become a short form of just environmental sustainability, but it does come out of the original concept of the Brundtland Commission with Our Common Future back in the 80s, which was Gro Brundtland was the former Prime Minister of Norway, and her commission came out with this concept of sustainability being balanced among three pieces, which is, the economy, the environment, and society or people. So thinking about the idea of sustainability is really this balance. It is not just talking about environmental sustainability, but it's looking more broadly at making sure these three elements are completely balanced. So ultimately, sustainability is about making the right long-term decisions. And this can be challenging if your client is a developer who's, their entire decision-making process is looking at maybe about 2 years until they hand it over to the condo board. But for most clients that we work with, they are going to own that asset going forward, especially if you're talking about any government bodies or a private homeowner. They live with these decisions that we make as architects for the next 30, 50, potentially even 100 years. So they live with it as clients, and as a society, we live with these decisions that we're making as architects, again, for these much longer period of times. So we really need to think about sustainability as making those right long-term decisions. However, what about the short term? We know construction costs have dramatically increased in the last little while. So this is a key issue that we need to address. It's an impact. It's a real thing for our clients going forward. We're seeing clients now who are starting to put work on hold because of construction escalation. So it isn't an issue that we need to think about, and there's ways that we can use these processes of the life cycle cost assessment and another concept that we're going to introduce later, the integrated design process, to look at both the short-term and long-term costs. But ultimately, it's great that we can find smart ways and maybe more efficient ways to build, but we can't afford the short-term thinking. We know what the impacts are of climate change. This is downtown Calgary. You can see the flooding that's impacted, and this is at just a 1.1, and now we're quite possibly heading towards meeting the 1.5 degree warming threshold set by the Paris agreements, potentially this year or shortly thereafter. So climate change has dramatically increased. So we know the impacts of even 1.1, which is this massive flooding, forest fires, which again, we saw dramatically last year. We're seeing the annual CO2 emissions continue to increase, which is driving these temperatures. And as I said, we're like 2023 kind of topped out at 1.45, and depending on which measure you use, but again, getting very close to that 1.5 level. And this has huge potential impacts. So this is, you can see even at a 2-degree temperature increase, we're looking at $2.7 billion in climate change costs. So these are costs that we're going to pay. It's like if I'm dating myself a little bit, but if you go back to the Fram commercial, you pay me now, you pay me later. If we don't make real action in the short term on this issue, we are going to be putting ourselves and our children in some really deep financial problems. We can go back to the 80s and 90s where there was huge concern about government debt and leaving that debt for our children and grandchildren, but we're causing this climate change debt again for our children and grandchildren. So hopefully we can take just as an aggressive approach to this debt crisis as we did in the 90s. And not only is this a societal problem, but it also impacts our clients. So natural gas prices are expected to double by 2030. So locking a client into a natural gas solution, may not really be in their best interest. And it's something we want to think about. You want to think about that, that question you might get from a client in 5 years, kind of like, hey, why am I paying all this money? Why did I get locked into this solution? So even if ultimately a natural gas solution is the solution for the project at this time, still thinking about what those transition options are. If you think of the Canadian Green Building Council, zero carbon building standard, they do talk about this idea of creating a transition plan. And there's some good guidance in that document about how making these transition plans off natural gas. So even if you're putting in natural gas, if it's the only solution for that particular project, thinking about what this transition is going to be critical. But the first choice, I think, now for all architects has got to be, and certainly falling down to our mechanical consultants, is thinking about what are the options to natural gas going forward. We're seeing this in New York City, in Vancouver, where they're starting to mandate no new natural gas for multi-residential projects going forward. So this is something I think that we have to put on the table for every project going forward. And natural gas can no longer be considered the default. I think it has to be considered guilty until proven innocent. Water is also a huge cost that often we forget about, but this research done for Brock University is showing that there's essentially a doubling in the price of water per cubic meter. And we're going to see this continuing to be a challenge. Even in the Great Lakes region, we've got to remember that only 1% of that water in the Great Lakes is actually renewable. It's actually coming from rainfall. The other 99% of that water is residual water from the glacier melts. So that water is not actually a renewable resource. It's also hugely impactful on this warming weather. We're seeing the Great Lakes traditionally have always been completely or almost completely covered with ice. That has prevented evaporation during, 3 to 4 months of the year during the winter time. That evaporation, for instance, for this year, the lakes were almost completely ice-free, meaning that evaporation continued. We're going to see dramatic increases in evaporation. That's going to, again, put a lot of pressure on the Great Lakes. So again, seeing water prices actually increase even more. We're also seeing drawdowns of aquifers for other purposes, like agriculture, which again will only drive up the price of water. So we need to think about being water efficient as well. And again, thinking about what those future impacts of our decisions are today on our client will be. And we're not talking huge, we're not talking 30, 40 years in the future. We're talking about by the 2030s. We're talking within the next decade of what these potential impacts on our clients will be. And a key thing is really to think about this cost of ownership. This example is from a healthcare project or from healthcare projects. And so there, it's a little different, this depending on the building type, but generally somewhere the entire construction cost is falling in somewhere between 8 and 10% of the overall cost of owning a building for 30 years. So they're big numbers, construction cost numbers, and people can get very excited about a large savings, whether that's $100,000 on a smaller project or tens of millions of dollars on a larger project, and potential savings by cutting out energy efficient carbon reduction strategies. But in the long term, there really is no payback. It's ultimately going to come back on the owner in not a good way. And it also isn't a price that they can't change. They're locked into those paying those higher prices based on the decisions that we made during construction. And this is often not well understood. Part of this is from a siloing, where you have a construction budget or a project budget and an operation budget, and those two never talk. But more and more, we're seeing more sophisticated clients that are using a cost of ownership type model. So what is cost of ownership? So cost of ownership is the capital itself, or the construction cost generally. Is the cost of that capital what you're paying for in interest rates to borrow that money if you're borrowing that cash? It's the operation and maintenance cost. It's the replacement cost over time. There's systems like mechanical systems that will need to be replaced, and it's the disposal cost at the end of the project. Now, and then there is a little bit of a negative in that you can then deduct from that cost of ownership the residual value of that asset at the end of the period that you're talking about, or the end of life, plus any appreciation of that asset over time as well. But it's really critical that clients understand that when they're building a building project, they're not just paying for that construction cost, they're actually paying for everything that's going to be associated with that asset over the next 30, 60, or potentially even 100 years. So we need to consider the 7 or even just 1 generation. So this is some research that was done by CAGBC, Canadian Green Building Council, looking at net zero carbon buildings. So, and what they were seeing is that you can, even with a 8% capital premium, like paying 8% more in construction costs, you're seeing a positive return of 1% over every year. And 1% might not sound very exciting, but you got to remember that that's a 1% return over the entire ownership costs versus a relatively small 8% increase in your capital costs. And as an example of this, we were working with a client that took this cost of ownership model. So we were able to look at, if we increase the construction cost by about 1%, which, of the overall cost, which translates into a 10% increase in their construction costs, we were then able to reduce their operational cost by 95%. So those are numbers that can help with this discussion with clients, and also think about really, again, risk, because those operational costs, we don't know where the cost of energy is going over 30 years. We don't know. So there's a high degree of risk involved in those costs over the long term. So if you can reduce those long-term costs, that has a real potential benefit for a client. And then it's even more interesting if we open the scope a little bit up and we think about not just construction, not just operational, but staff costs. Now, some of these are a little more difficult to associate. It depends on the type of use of the building. Things like call centers, for instance, are very closely monitored for their productivity. So it's pretty easy to show where some of these numbers come from. But again, the staff costs that people are putting into a building dramatically outweigh any of the operational or construction costs. So doing small architectural moves that improve productivity, whether that's like daylight views, whether that's being more bespoke with the design to improve efficiency, these can have huge impacts on costs. We certainly see this a lot in healthcare, where there's a very tight focus on the programming of space to reduce nurse walk distances, for instance, because these can have such a major impact on the overall operation costs of a hospital. So again, looking at this at other sectors can make a huge difference in the impact. So we need to think about construction costs not just as a cost, it's really an investment. So if I'm putting money into a mutual fund or other investment instrument, I'm not necessarily seeing that as a cost. I'm seeing it as an investment that is proved out. So to think about those construction costs much more as an investment, we need to start using investment tools to make that argument. And one of the key tools that comes out of the investment world is the life cycle cost analysis. And with this, I'm going to pass it over to Jeff to talk a little bit more about this life cycle cost analysis approach.
Great, thanks, Peter. So a life cycle cost analysis, or an LCCA, what is it? So as Peter was talking, we're trying to determine effectively the total cost of ownership, right? So what does it cost you in its totality to own and operate this building over its entire life cycle? Now, I think we're all pretty familiar with the first two on the left, the planning and acquisition phases. That's, our fees, that's the capital cost to build it. But what about these three on the right from there, right? And as Peter was mentioning, especially for a long life cycle asset, that total cost of ownership, those latter parts of this life cycle can actually outweigh significantly the initial capital investment. Okay, next slide, Peter. So that's what it is, but who cares? Why do you care? And the reason is because your clients care, right? We all know that the people who make an architectural vision happen are the people who hold the purse strings, the people that write the checks. So if you can establish a business case as to why doing the right thing actually is going to cost less money in the long term, you can build that consensus, you can get clients on board, you can get the people signing the checks to do the right thing and build a really great building. Next slide. So how can you do it? Well, there's a few different ways. One of the ways you can do it is with publicly available tools. The zero carbon building standard from the CAJBC has a handy little calculator. This looks at things like capital costs. It looks at things like the discount rate. For those not familiar with that terminology, discount rate is essentially if you were to invest that money in something else, say put it in bonds or the stock market, how much money would it make over this life cycle asset versus investing it in an energy efficiency measure? So what we're trying to get is something called a net present value. So that's looking at the future cost of this in today's dollars, accounting for inflation, for a discount rate, for carbon taxes, all these sort of things. So this is a great tool that takes all that into consideration, O&M costs, pretty intuitive to use. Now, a question that often comes up in these discussions is, well, what happens? I just mentioned carbon tax and the cost of future carbon. What happens if we axe the tax, right? That's a bit of a phrase right now. So we've had some discussions on that, and people in the fossil fuel industry have had discussions on that. And the consensus is that regardless of whether it's a carbon tax or it's an incentive-based program like the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, there will continue to be a cost on carbon. So you're not, this methodology will continue to hold true regardless of the political regime. Next slide, Peter. So a bit of a trigger warning here for anyone that's done their Passive House exams. you might remember what this looks like. But if it's not a sophisticated client who's sensitive to things like escalating carbon costs and these sort of things, let's say as a single family homeowner, you're doing a custom home, you can just do some good old fashioned math to do these calculations. And I know some of these formulas look intimidating, but I think you all went to architecture school. You all had to study calculus, right? And this is not that. This is a little more simple than that. Next slide, Peter. So the important thing here, though, is when you're doing this is the quality of your information. You need to have your cost estimate be tight. Your energy model needs to be reasonably accurate. And your financial analysis needs to be reasonably sophisticated, because garbage in, garbage out, right? Unless all three of those things are high quality, your life cycle cost analysis is not going to be high quality. Next slide, Peter. So we'll tell a little story about how the quality of information is so important. This is a case study. It's a small community hospital, 24-bed inpatient unit, small emergency department, diagnostic imaging, outpatient services. And I can't say too much about the project because it's currently in the RFP phase, but it's doing some really great things, and you'll definitely be hearing about it in the future. For the purposes of this webinar, I just want to tell the story. So where we started, this is in Prince Edward County, Ontario, in Picton. And those of you who know Picton, it's a really interesting region where there's a population with a relative high wealth and education and an interest in sustainability and green things. So we had quite a bit of interest from donors, as well as the steering committee for the project, in doing something sustainable. So we established kind of a green baseline, here's our best practices, here's what we're going to do no matter what. But then we actually had the steering committee come up with some ideas as to what they might want to see, which are listed here. These were our big ideas for the project. And if you go to the next slide. Then we had the stakeholders, include this, not just the steering committee, but also, nursing staff and operations and maintenance, rank these ideas among different criteria, right? So what's the impact of something like mass timber on energy use, or embodied carbon, or community, environment, all these things. And the idea here was that we were building consensus, right? So these ideas came from them, and then we had them establish those priorities. And so we want to start with strategy and then move to tactics, right? When you start with lead, you're kind of confined to a checklist of technical solutions. And it's like, okay, can we do these 10 things to get these credits? Whereas if you align yourself with the client's priorities, you have that buy-in from day one. It makes for a much more successful project. So those of you who have done a project with Infrastructure Ontario, where you've gone through the savings by design process, will be familiar with this. It's sponsored by Enbridge, and it's for smaller projects, not the big P3s, but kind of in the $100 million range. And it's something that Infrastructure Ontario imposes on projects, where it's a full day workshop, where you have a host of different experts in sustainability. There's some energy modelers, engineers, architects, wellness professionals, all these people. And they look at your project, and the team comes up with ideas, and then they build this very high level energy model kind of on the fly. And by the end of this 7-hour workshop, you get an output saying, here's your ideas, here's what your simple return on investment would be for these ideas. So it's not a bad program in that it gives you some early insight, and it gets people talking, but it does have its limitations. So one of those limitations is that the quality of that energy model is not that great, and the sophistication of the financial analysis also not that great. So I know that's hard to see, it's quite small, but geothermal was one of the ideas for this project, and we were seeing a simple return on investment of 300 years for that. We said, okay, wait, that's that can't be right. No one's ever seen this, right? We talked to a bunch of people internally and externally, and no one's ever seen a 300-year ROI on geothermal. So something must be wrong. So we said, okay, let us look at this a little bit closer. So if you go to the next slide, we were able to refine that a little bit. We often get caught in this trap of thinking of sustainability or energy saving features as an extra, right? Something that just adds cost to the project. Whereas there are actually trade-offs here. So in the case of geothermal, right, you have most of your heating and cooling coming from that heat pump. You don't need as many boilers, chillers, cooling towers. And the cost estimator forgot to delete those things. So we looked at the estimate, said, hey, hang on a second, there's some deletions you need to include. And it looked a little bit better, but it was still 260 years. So something's still clearly not right here. So we said, please let us study this further. We really, really want to study this further. Something's not right. We really think this could work. But the client basically said, no, sorry, we're done on this. Let it go. We're doing other great things on this project. Geothermal is never going to work. So that was a bit disappointing. But then something interesting happened. The pandemic. And when I say a bit of luck, it's a bit tongue in cheek. It was lucky for us, not for not for everybody else. But the director of facilities on this project didn't want to get vaccinated. And at the time, healthcare facilities around the world were mandating that their staff be vaccinated. And they refused. And as a result, they were let go, relieved from their position. We had a new director who started, and he was a sustainability-minded person and said, hey, have you guys considered geothermal? Like, maybe you should look into this. And it was like, yes, please, let's. So just a little bit of a random twist there where geothermal was suddenly back on the table. Next slide. So we knew we needed better information. So we hired an expert. We worked with a geothermal consultant who just had a lot more experience and knowledge around the design and operation of these systems than our mechanical engineers did. So we got a better geodesign that was tighter, had better predicted modeling, and we were able to plug that into our energy model and our cost estimates. We also were able, as I said, we were able to refine the energy model so the thing with like eQuest and IES and the savings by design model is they just don't handle geothermal really well. It needs to be done externally, right? And it's usually done in like Excel, and then you kind of plug those numbers back into your modeling software. So these are some graphs of how we modeled the actual ground source loop for this project based on our loads and got, much more refined energy modeling information there. Next slide. Additionally, the energy model in general, the savings by design model, it's fine for discussion purposes, but we really want an energy model to reflect the way that a building is expected to operate, right? Not a hypothetical code building. Who cares what a hypothetical code building does? We want to see how buildings, other similar buildings operate and align our model to that so we can actually see how much energy we can save compared to a peer facility. So those who aren't familiar with the Greening Health program, this graph is from that. The majority of hospitals in Ontario, a number in Alberta, some in the US, the UK, are all part of this program, and they actually monitor their energy performance over time and record it and document it and benchmark it against each other. And so this is overall energy for Ontario acute care hospitals. But within that information provided by Greening Health, you can actually drill down into what the expected energy use intensity is for end uses like plug loads, right? Rather than making a random assumption based on what the National Energy Code says, you can say, okay, what did a similar hospital in the same climate zone, what were their plug loads? Because mine are probably going to be similar. Really tighten up that energy model. Next slide. So we got our capital cost estimate better. We got our energy model better, but our financial analysis was still pretty simple. And the problem with simple payback is that there's things it doesn't take into consideration. So when we did the math based on this new information, our ROI is down to 31 years. So that's a lot better than 260 years. Obviously, those first two pieces were of poor quality, but we wanted to push this a little bit further. So we looked at net present value, like we were talking about earlier. We need to consider all these things. So this cash flow series takes the price of carbon over time. This is a 100-year facility, right? It's a long life cycle asset. A geothermal field has a 100-year life cycle as well, but our study window is only 25 years. So what happens after those 25 years? Well, there's still value left in that geothermal field, which is what we call residual value. That needs to be added back into the calculation. And we need to be looking at what is the cost of natural gas going to be in 2050, not today. So that escalating cash flow series, the inclusion of residual value, application of appropriate discount rates, inclusion of things like inflation, and volatility factors for natural gas. Electricity goes up every year, but it tends to be fairly level, right? Whereas in 2022, the price of natural gas doubled overnight when Russia invaded Ukraine, and we don't see electricity double overnight. So you need to consider volatility as well. So this much more sophisticated financial analysis, we got our NPV down below 20 years. Which is what the client was looking for. They were looking for a return on investment of less than 20 years, and we were able to demonstrate that. So with this business case, they took this to the Ministry of Health. And for those who have worked with the Ministry of Health, this is kind of unheard of because the budget is the budget. But they said, look, we think this is a good business case for us, and it's going to save us a lot of money over the long term. Our total cost of ownership is going to be lower if we do this. And the ministry, reviewed it all and said, yeah, okay, we'll increase the funding for the project so you can get that in there. Which is an unusual thing, but it was the rigor of the business case that really swayed them to do that. So next slide. And also, so yeah, we also looked at solar, and we did kind of a simple payback calculation with solar. We used PV Watts, which is a free tool where you can kind of estimate the solar production for a specific site, and then did a simple payback analysis, and it was around 20 years, right? And your life cycle on solar panels is around 20 years. And we said, not sure. But the client, was keen. They said, well, I'd like you to look at this a little bit closer. Let's do a proper, analysis, more sophisticated financials, better design, better capital costing, and see where we land. And so we hired a solar specialist, and they drilled into it, similar to the geothermal example. The results were a lot better. You can see it's like 6.5 years is the return on investment. The other thing that was kind of interesting, because of the capital model for healthcare, where the ministry pays 90% of the costs and the owner pays 10% of the costs, which they fundraise for and these sort of things. The client's comment was, even if it's break even for the taxpayers, it's 90% benefits for me. Because I'm only paying for 10% of the capital cost. It was like, okay, well, when you frame it that way, yeah, all right, sure. So yeah, just to reinforce the quality of the information you have makes a big difference in the outcome that you're going to get. Back to Peter.
Yeah. So thanks, Jeff. Yeah, no, it's a great example, and I think there's some key things to pull out of that, right? One is the kind of don't take no for an answer. I think a lot of times we're initially discouraged sometimes. So when your gut says that something's probably working, it's worth it to do that second effort to reach down into it. The other thing is really about getting that right advice. Too often, and no disrespect to our colleagues in mechanical, electrical, and structural disciplines, but in a lot of cases they are wanting to do what they did last time, and they may have a certain area of expertise. So it's really important to make sure that the consultants you're bringing it onto a project have the requisite expertise, and if they don't, that you're reaching out to people who do have that additional level of expertise that can make some of these judgment calls and really guide that process. I did want to also talk about, so a lot of the examples and a lot of the discussion you'll see are around energy, but there are other options to think about. So even like looking at materials, doing research on things like linoleum, versus VCT. So vinyl composite tile, we know, has some sustainability issues around it. Linoleum is a almost completely natural material made with jute and linseed and minerals. So it's a really great product. But again, it usually comes in, and as you can see, the initial install cost. And this is using a calculator from Tarkett, the flooring manufacturer. So they sell all these products. They're neutral. They'll sell you whatever you want. But they have this great tool on their website where you can do these super quick LCCA examples. So this is just looking at the linoleum. You can see that install. It's almost twice the cost to install linoleum. But you see the dramatic reduction in costs for operation, for the ownership of that. So again, if you're talking about school boards or other municipal bodies maybe that are a little limited on their operational side, and you certainly always hear maintenance free. Well, nothing is maintenance free, but we can reduce maintenance. And so investing a little bit in that capital for the linoleum is going to reduce your maintenance costs in the long run. So that's something that can, is really quick and easy to do. Green roofs are kind of interesting. We did an analysis on for a hospital project, and this is going to be highly dependent on the site that you're dealing with and the municipal restrictions. So in this case, the municipality was really restricting the volume of water that we could put into the storm system. In fact, basically, we're limited to what was currently produced on the site, and the site was almost entirely green. So very little stormwater from the existing site. And then we had to look at what the strategies were to limit that stormwater. So in our initial discussions, the civil consultant came back with massive tanks to basically retain the water. And so we kind of said, well, maybe there's another way to look at this. We looked at using a kind of sponge roof, or sometimes referred to as kind of like a purple roof or a green roof, but essentially we're just retaining water on the roof and then planting on top. And we looked at that versus the cost of concrete tanks. And we were able to show that there was actually an 18% less expensive day one cost, not to mention that, looking at the maintenance costs between a green roof and tanks, where we kind of found we're more or less a wash between what would be required. We were looking at a very simple sedum roof, so there wasn't a lot of maintenance required to it. So, and we weren't doing an irrigation system on the roof. We were allowing it to kind of naturally go brown in August. So we were looking at basically a reduction in costs right up front in the construction costs by going with this green roof as opposed to underground tanks. So that was an interesting example. Also not just thinking about our buildings, but sometimes, especially when we're talking to healthcare clients, this kind of resonates with them. So this is a study from Toronto Public Board of Health in 2014, and looking at air quality. And some of these numbers I actually just found shocking, that each year in the city of Toronto, there's 1,300 premature deaths due to air quality, which is, when you think about it, it's just astounding. You think about the numbers we saw through COVID, and you saw that reaction to COVID, yet we're having higher numbers even with air quality, and yet we're not seeing the same response. Seeing more than 3,500 hospitalizations per year. And if you average that cost of what it costs our system for a hospitalization, that turns out to $27.7 million per year. And that's not even taking into account lost productivity and other knock-on effects from that impact of the hospitalizations. So that's a dramatic number. And when you can put it that way to a hospital, and you're saying, well, maybe the first response is, well, that's probably a lot of that air quality problems are coming from industrial sources. That's not actually the case. We found that, or this is from the Toronto Board of Health, they found that, a lot of the hospitalizations is due to traffic, which is something as architects we control by thinking about how our buildings are situated, how we make other forms of transportation, active transportations, attractive to people, so they're not using a private car. Also, you'll start to see these numbers reduce with electrification of vehicles, and more EVs will reduce that. But also the buildings. So number 2 after traffic is actually buildings, is residential and commercial buildings. So when we're talking to a hospital, and you're talking, well, you've got these massive natural gas boilers, which are putting particulate matter into the air, that is actually a direct connection to the number of people who show up in your emergency room. That starts to have a very different conversation with healthcare professionals than traditional either energy savings or costs on carbon, or other discussions around kind of sustainability, more generally. And making that real for the client is critical. And you can do some of this analysis and come up with some of these numbers. Also want to talk a little bit about SROI. So we've been talking a lot about just the pure economics. But our group here, and it's interesting to be here at HDR, which is a large consultancy organization that includes economists as part of the group. And it's kind of terrifying. Like, if you think it's terrifying to put a number on hospitalizations and premature deaths, well, the economists can put a number on basically everything. So they've started to look at not just these kind of economic costs, but also thinking about what are the social costs and social benefits of different strategies, and the idea of generally reducing GHGs and how that results in not just economic and life cycle costs as noted at the top, but also the environmental benefits and the social benefits, and being able to put actual dollars and cents numbers on those, and coming up with this kind of overall sustainable return on investment. So, heard a lot about life cycle costs analysis, and if you've done them or heard of them before, I'm sure a lot of this was not necessarily a surprise. Hopefully we've given you a little bit of extra detail and examples on how to complete them. But they are such an important and powerful tool that we're now starting to see them more and more as being required by either clients or jurisdictions. So for the federal government, for green government strategy, all major building retrofits, new buildings and retrofits require a GHG reduction cost lifecycle analysis. This is what it looks like. They're very prescriptive in the guide. There's essentially 4 options that you run the lifecycle cost against. So your first one is basically taking a base case or baseline option, which is kind of business as normal. If we didn't do anything to reduce emissions other than meet basic minimum standards, what would it look like? Your second option is to find GHG emissions that will be cost neutral over 40 years. So that's kind of, Jeff was using the example where that particular client was looking at a 25-year payback. Essentially here, the federal government is looking for a 40-year payback. And so you put in all your examples for that. Then you look at designs to achieve maximum GHG reduction. So that's basically not concerned really with payback at all. They're just looking to maximize the GHG. And then finally, you've got these hybrid options of looking at taking advantages and disadvantages of both. So you need to run these four options. And if you're doing a federal government project, that means either you're doing it or you're hiring a consultant to do it. But it is a requirement, so it's something that you would do on that is required for each project. Now, also, you're starting to see this in the city of Vancouver now is talking about is requiring LCCAs for rezoning, and city of Toronto through the TGS hasn't quite got there yet, but I wouldn't necessarily be surprised. Now, thinking about LCAs, garbage in, garbage out. Primarily, LCCAs are based on efficiency measures and choosing the right efficiency measures. We've done peer reviews on LCCAs where they looked at, really, to be honest, strange efficiency measures that actually didn't result in any reduction. We were looking at a lab building that was, its energy use was primarily driven by ventilation, and yet the LCCA looked at 4 different levels of insulation on the envelope, which, again, because the energy was not being driven by the envelope, it was being driven by the ventilation requirements. So it had almost 0 impact on the energy efficiency. And so they came back, well, there's no point in doing any energy efficiency measures because none of them have any kind of real payback. And it's like, well, that's because you looked at the wrong ones. You would have been way better to look at measures that either control the ventilation or use heat recovery from the ventilation. So it's critical that the right efficiency measures are used in your LCCA. And one of the key ways of doing this is the integrated design process, which Jeff kind of alluded to in his presentation. So traditionally, we have a very linear process, right? Client asks for it. we as the architects design it, and in this case, maybe it's a glass box. The engineer then fixes that glass box using a whole bunch of equipment, and then the cost consultant prices it, and lo and behold, it comes in over budget. It goes back to the architect, and usually, strangely, very rarely do I see that the engineers really need to do a lot of value engineering. Almost always it comes down to the architecture. And I think part of that is just, the engineers pull out some spreadsheets and some really complicated looking math and say, okay, well, if you want to do the math and show us how we save money, and everybody backs away. So they just go, well, I think the architects, couldn't you make the windows smaller? We all know where this goes. So anyway, we compromise our design. The engineer fixes it again. It goes to the price, cost consultant, probably it works out. And then really cynically, then it goes to the sustainability group to kind of make it look green. Okay, well, we can't make LEED gold anymore, but at least we can make LEED silver. Fine. We just greenwash the thing, send it out the door. So we really need to think about a better way of working. And this is really thinking about this integrated design process where we're bringing everybody into the room at the beginning of the project, at the early stages. And Jeff was showing those examples of bringing in the client, user groups, other people to define what those efficiency measures should be early on in the project. And that does two things. One is you're more likely to get much better efficiency measures that actually reduce emissions. And number two is you're getting that buy-in from clients and from the owners, so that when push comes to shove and you reach those value engineering discussions, they've already accepted that the energy efficiency proposals or the carbon reduction proposals are the right things for the project. So that's critical. And so the integrated design process was actually, it's a Canadian invention, came out of National Research Council through, sorry, I'm forgetting his first name, but Niels Larson, I believe. So it's a Canadian invention. We should really use it. But since it's been a Canadian invention, it's kind of gone worldwide. And it was found as one of the key ways of really achieving a cost-efficient energy reductions as the strategy. And it works a little differently. As you can see, this model, it's working more as with a number of these feedback loops through the design process. And I've just kind of simplified that in a little bit of a way of thinking, first of all, what the key elements of the integrated design process are. So first of all, it's, as Jeff was mentioning, it's defining that shared scope and vision and objectives for the project, and doing that upfront before you start the horse trading on saving costs. The other key thing is that it's effective collaboration. We often, again, the architects kind of design it, we throw it over the wall, and the engineers kind of fix it. And so many times in my career, I get the question back from our consultants, well, give it to me when your design is frozen. And my response to that is usually, okay, well, that's when the shop, that will be the as-built, right? Like the whole point of our process is it's an iterative process. We're supposed to be taking advantage and leveraging everyone's skills through an iterative design process. So making sure that you have effective collaboration. You also need to foster innovation by asking what if, taking these open-minded, creative approaches to problem solving. And again, that's really critical on the part of your consultants, that they're there to be part of that process. They're excited about being part of the process. And I would really suggest that when you're choosing consultants, you're choosing the consultants based on that. The next thing is it has to be evidence-based. You're using energy models, you're using LCCAs to make decisions based on actual evidence, not just opinion. And then finally, it's an iterative process with feedback loops. So you're going to, develop, test, and optimize, and you're going to repeat that loop throughout the process. So applying the kind of, idealistic kind of integrated design process to our more linear process could look something like this. So really the key point is starting right at the preliminary design, right after you're hired by the owner with this integrated design charrette. And that's bringing everybody in the table together, as Jeff was mentioning. It's bringing in clients, it's bringing in user groups, it's bringing in your consultants, it's bringing in all the key stakeholders to have that discussion about what are the goals and parameters for this project. Then as you move through the design process, you're going to do that integrated design charrette with the project vision. You're going to do some early energy modeling, and then you're going to ask yourself, is the design complying with that original design charrette vision? Then as you go through detailed design, you're going to do more iterative energy modeling. And then again, you're going to come back to the, and test that against your original project vision, your original, or sometimes it's referred to the owner's requirement statements. So you're constantly kind of coming back and testing against your original intent. And then finally, ideally, you're getting to the end of construction when you do your measurement and verification. And again, you're testing that against the original intent. And that then allows lessons learned to be then fed back into the owner. So when they issue their next RFP, they already have some benchmark data. So maybe they're able to issue UI targets or total energy use targets. They can mandate or better improve the integrated design process and make sure that that's written into their RFP documents. One example, it was a project we did with adaptive comfort. And adaptive comfort is interesting. There's this great tool. Again, it's free, and this is from University of California, Berkeley's Center for the Built Environment. So it's a great free online tool that you can use. And it allows you to test a number of measures to ensure meeting ASHRAE 55, which is for comfort, but allows you to ask a bunch of questions. So in this case, we started by asking the client, what is your business culture? And, do you really need, are you expecting people to show up in man era suits every day? And they were like, no, actually they were more scientific in basis. And actually a lot of people come up from the field. So they're going to be showing up in shorts and t-shirts. And, they're like, you know what? And that's fine for our business culture. We're totally fine with that. So that allowed us to, if you see down here at clothing level, we're able to change the clothing level down to walking shorts. And that allows people to be more comfortable, even if the temperatures, instead of setting the temperature at 21 degrees C, you actually set the temperatures higher. We also talked about things like ceiling fans, and by increasing wind speed, again, you can make people feel more comfortable at higher set point temperatures. So we're able to build that into the tool as well in the airspeed. So that was we were able to then change the set points. And this had a big impact on our energy use overall. We were able to get a 5% reduction in energy use. But one of the key things, it was able to bring down our peak cooling by 10%. And that reduced our entire HVAC system. And because we were able to run through this tool, it's ASHRAE approved, and we ran through it with the client, that gave our mechanical consultants comfort to make those changes to reduce the HVAC system. And we were able to eliminate the perimeter cooling on the project, which resulted in immediate cost savings and a small but significant year-over-year operational savings. And again, I want to really stress that, again, a lot of our consultants, rightfully so, are nervous about some of these approaches because they're concerned that as you go through the value engineering, that these strategies might get value engineered out, and then they're stuck holding the bag. They're either redesigning or they're potentially sued because people aren't comfortable anymore. So you really have to develop the process that people are feeling comfortable, they're involved in the process, they feel that they're part of the decision making. If you keep everybody in their own silos, that level of comfort is never going to be achieved. Another example here is using electrochromatic glass. So this was with a hospital here that people probably recognize. It's Humber River here in Toronto, right off the 401. And here the option here was to use electrochromatic glass instead of the traditional roller shades or blinds within the hospital. This was a result, obviously there was a capital cost. There was a large capital cost. It essentially almost doubled the cost of the glass. But when we talked with management, with care and maintenance staff, the architects and mechanical engineers, we found actually there is a huge cost savings over time, because what it did was it eliminated the blinds and shades, which required to be cleaned, and it caused infection control issues. And then also it meant that care staff, primarily nurses, if the blinds were left open, closed, they were having to deal with this, and constant maintenance callbacks from blinds getting ripped or torn or weren't operating correctly. So that actually saved a lot of money from the owners and operations side. And obviously it had an impact on reducing the solar gain for the project. So at the end of the day, with the integrated design process, we're looking for these win-wins. We're looking for these things that have initial and or life cycle cost reductions. We're looking for things that improve the experience for staff and clients and occupants of buildings. We're looking for things that might impact also on environmental and social governance rankings or ratings, which more and more of our clients are participating in. Public and staff perception of the building can be important, and really being part of this solution, bringing people into the process has a really massive impact on the support for and buy-in on parts of users for what might seem to be new technology. Again, anytime you introduce a new or an innovative approach, there's often some pushback from maintenance staff or operational staff because they haven't seen it before. But if they are brought in as part of the solution, they're often much more open to having these discussions. So there are some words of caution. We talked about data quality, garbage in and garbage out. So we've got to be very critical on what our data quality is. The crystal balling, we are trying to predict the future here. So clients must be aware that there's an inherent, and for architects, uninsured risk there. So clients must be, accepting of this. And this is no different than when you sign on for an ETF or a mutual fund or any other investment instrument. That, there's always that caveat, that past performance is not guaranteed future results. And again, we've got to make clients very clear on that understanding. These are best guesses of what future conditions could be, especially when you're talking about predicting things 30 or 40 years out. Commitment of the whole team is required, and there's this focusing on the upfront efforts, putting more effort into that early design stage, even at the beginning or very early stages of schematic design. There's also some words of encouragement. Ultimately, we generally find that when you go through this process, you're investing in architecture. You're often reducing the need for mechanical electrical systems. That means that budget piece can then be moved into doing better architecture, whether that's things like triple glazing or making more, more habitable, better views, better daylight in the spaces. There's certainly some easy wins around building orientation and getting that right. Again, very low cost solution, but can have impact on energy savings. Being strategic with glazing, maximizing insulation, all these things are often low cost, easy wins. Thinking again about the long-term design, and you think, and that's, I think all architects want to see their work there for the long haul, as opposed to something that's just there up for 30 years and then it's falling apart and then it needs to be demolished and replaced. So it's about creating these durable, long-lasting materials. And ultimately, it's about quality over quantity. So it's about investing in efficient, high-performance systems. So leave with just two thoughts. First of all, I think this was a prescient quote from Buckminster Fuller there about being called to be architects of the future, not its victims. So really thinking, as architects, of thinking about what that future condition might be so that we're designing for that. And I want to leave with, this is a picture from the Prince Edward Viaduct here in Toronto, where, some visionary designers were thinking about a subway that took over 50 years from the design of the bridge to when that subway was realized. But by creating this space for a subway in the bridge design back in 1916, when the bridge was actually built, and the subway didn't come in until the 60s, saved huge amounts of money. And here's a great example of thinking about that future generation and what was a very small incremental cost in the construction, making a huge dramatic advantage for future generations. And with that, that's the end of our presentation. I can see there's a fair number of questions that we should probably start getting at here.
Yes, exactly, Peter. Thank you very much for the great presentation. And just a reminder for all members, if you have any questions, please do post them into the Q&A window. Peter and Jeff are going to address these right now. Thank you.
Okay. So, Jeff, I don't believe you can see these, so I'll just kind of read them out. And first question here from Donald: what is the verifiable and reliable reference on the slide showing operations versus construction cost? And yeah, I think, as I was saying, data is critical, the quality of the data. Nothing is ever going to be 100%. Just like making investment decisions, you're making predictions into the future. So you do have to be ensure that you're making, that you're using, the best available sources of information, and that you're putting in very reasonable assumptions on things like discount rates and inflation rates. I don't know, Jeff, do you want to put anything more on it?
Yeah, I think you're talking specifically about the one where it was a pie graph where we showed 8% of the total project cost is construction. So that comes from hospitals in the US. There was a broad-based survey that was done. I forget the organization that actually did it, but that is US-based data looking at US hospitals. But it is similar here when we've drilled into that on our projects.
Yeah, and there's similar studies have been done by USGBC in the States, and I would say that, and some of the work that we've done with some of the school boards here, particularly York, find that buildings are typically ranging in that 10% too. However, that is highly variable depending on the building type. Obviously, if you're doing a 5-star luxury hotel with lots of marble in the lobby and those kind of things, well, that might drive up construction costs versus operation. And if you're doing operation in more, like if it's in Vancouver with, well, which up until recently has been a much milder climate, that will have impacts as well. Next question here is: when you compare operations to construction costs, you appear not to include total operating cost of business activity that goes on inside of the building. Yes, that's true, and I hope that talking about the staff kind of had an impact, kind of address that a little bit. The other one too is interesting is when we've worked with retail clients, and they're really talking about sales per square foot on some of their operation, some of theirs as well. And so if you can show, like for instance, there was an interesting study that Walmart did where they showed that sales increased, I believe it was 10 or 15% by naturally daylit spaces versus spaces that were forlessively lit. And so that drove Walmart for a while to put a lot of skylights in their buildings, because they saw that, that was more important for them than the cost of a skylight. They've since pulled back on that because they found that the more natural daylit from the LED lighting had a very similar effect. So now they're just achieving the same effect with LED lighting. We'll have to probably jump through these a little bit quicker. From Nicholas, I've heard some arguments that despite best efforts in being as efficient as possible and reducing the lifetime impact of building costs, it will not be sufficient given the existing building stock and current market trends. The argument is that we must be carbon negative and energy positive buildings. Yeah, so definitely retrofitting of existing buildings are critical. You know, and although when you start to include the embodied carbon of new construction, and if you look at Ontario, where we have building 1.5 million new houses in the next whatever it is, 10 years target, building new still has a very large impact. So I wouldn't hold back and sometimes I think it's a little bit of a straw man argument to say that if we can't fix what's already existing, then there's no point doing anything. I think we got to focus on what we are working on primarily, although ideally, yeah, we're seeing a lot more retrofits happen. And then we have a question on what project type and scale are the data drawn on. That might have been going back to that question with pie chart. So again, that was, as Jeff mentioned, that's from hospital projects. From Krista, how do small firms for small projects access data and support to describe construction increase in operational savings? So this is a good question. There are a number of facilities available. I understand that you might not be having a third-party cost consultant doing your cost measurements, but generally, smaller firms are generally can approach because in public sector particularly, we can't necessarily talk to the contractors before we go out for tender. So it's obviously very critical to get some of that cost information from trusted contractors that you're working with. So that's one source. And there's some great sources from CMHC, Canadian Housing and Mortgage Corporation, on energy efficiency measures. And there's also from the National Research Council. They actually have a test house in their Ottawa facility where they're testing different energy efficiency strategies and seeing what those paybacks are. They have two semi-divided houses where they test different measures. They keep one house the same and test with another with the identical house right next door. So there's some good data from them. So I'd suggest reaching out to that. Jeff, I don't know if you have other, or maybe from Passive House as well.
Yeah, Passive House does. I'm also thinking, on the O&M side is something where we're a little bit lost sometimes, where it's like, well, I don't know what it costs to maintain a boiler versus a heat pump over 30 years. ASHRAE has a number of data sources that are publicly available that you can just kind of Google and you can find them. But they've done extensive studies and surveys on these sort of things and do publish O&M costs for various system types and these sort of things. So sometimes it's picking and choosing from different places to pull together the information you need to really complete a fulsome life cycle cost analysis. But it is all generally publicly available information and not something that's proprietary to large firms.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is just thinking about, again, this helps when you have when you are dealing with a more sophisticated client, but is pulling in through the IPD process their facility management team. And often larger organizations will have energy efficiency either directors or even a whole team. Like for instance, at the City of Toronto, they have that. So by reaching out, and often it's funny when we reach out to them, they're like, this is great, because usually we're just given the building at the end of the project and just basically told fix it. So they're usually more than happy to get involved at the design process and provide you with some of that data. And they can actually be really excellent proponents and champions for sustainability sustainability measures based on their lived experience of having to deal with, older infrastructure. Then we have a question here from Patrick Bernier regarding capital cost impact. You mentioned 95% reduction on capital costs. Did you mean 5? Yes, I did. Sorry. So thanks for catching that. From John Souls, we have, what was the rationale for concluding that the pandemic led to geothermal? Jeff, you can summarize that briefly.
The pandemic didn't lead to geothermal. No, it caused a leadership change on the client side, and the new leadership was interested in geothermal and allowed us to put it back on the table to study it further. Is how that worked.
So again, another question from Krista about the costs of the studies of the consultants, and how do you justify that on smaller projects? Again, it's, again, on smaller projects, a lot of this, and this is where you might want to look into Passive House, because it does really train you into being able to do a lot of this research and studies yourself to make that business case. Because I can certainly understand hiring a third-party consultant to do an energy model, which, depending on your project, could be anywhere between $25,000 and $75,000. Can be a big drag for a smaller project, but I don't know, Jeff, if you wanted to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Passive House, like we showed, there's some simple mathematical formulas you can do, and they don't take into consideration things like the cost of carbon, but it's more sophisticated than a simple payback ROI calculation. We also use we've been using Cove Tool a lot, which is much lighter weight, more intuitive. It's subscription based, but you can do those energy models yourself without a ton of specialized knowledge. And then if we need the rigor of an EQuest model or something, we'll kick that over to an energy modeler. But when we're experimenting, looking at iterative design features, we'll just use Cove Tool. It's something I'd really recommend looking into as a great lightweight energy model tool for early design exploration.
And just from Emad Macau, and sorry if I mispronounced that. So just this question about condos and becoming challenging to convince developers. Yeah, I agree. And again, because condo developers are typically just looking at that 2 years until they hand it over to the condo board. But I have started to see condo developments being marketed on their costs of ownership and their annual or monthly fees, their condo fees. So that might be a way of convincing condo developers to say, look, you could go out in the market with much lower condo fees, and does that make a difference for you? Richard Shaw has a question about integrated design process and if it requires additional consulting fees to complete. And the first answer is ideally this is something you're having in discussions with, kind of your pre-positioning discussions with your clients, so that they're writing it into the RFP, so everybody is kind of pricing the same thing. Ideally, the integrated process is not adding a lot of money in fees, because the idea is really that you're upfronting those costs into the earlier design phase, and then the idea is that then there's less changes and less coordination problems as you go through the project. So that's one of the key pieces. And then what was the reference for the IPD illustration? So that's from Neil Larson at the National Research Council. That was from Donald Ardell. And then from Swapil Patel, well, just great presentation. Thank you. That's great. And then we have another question. Can we get the PDF or the PowerPoint of the file? Yes, and I believe Felix is sending that out. And then a note that the RAIC guide has a similar diagram regarding integrated design process. And yeah, absolutely. And they've been great proponents for it. Suzanne Crysdale has a question. We're facing two issues related to this topic. One, our fees are increasing to support the consulting relating to this, and we need to convince our clients of the value. And I'm curious if others have had that issue. And two, it's hard to convince clients to look beyond construction costs if they can't see ROI value. So how do we sell ROI? Those are excellent kind of questions. Jeff, did you want to maybe start on that?
Yeah, so if you think back to the slide about, what a life cycle cost assessment is, that first phase is planning, right? That's part of the life cycle cost, is our fees to study this and design it and test it and compare it. So when you're making a business case proposition to a client, it often is an additional fee item, right? Where it says, we want to do this study and we want to prove to you that this is a good investment or not. But you have to pay us to do that, right? We're not in the habit of working for free. That being said, if you build it into your process, it doesn't need to take a ton of time. Like if it's something fairly lightweight, and you already have a cost estimator on the project on the owner side, which most, larger public projects do. I understand, custom homes typically wouldn't, but it's kind of just looking at the cost estimate, doing some pulling in information from your energy model and doing a bit of math. It's, a handful of hours to really get some preliminary ROI numbers, and not something you need additional fees for necessarily. On the other part about how to convince clients unless they're seeing an ROI, well, I think that's what you're trying to do with the life cycle cost assessment is show them what the ROI is or isn't, so that they know, right? So they're paying for a degree of certainty.
Yeah, and I would say it's really critical to have this discussion, because I don't think most clients really think about the cost of ownership. And so it's having that discussion with them is key. From Daniel Johnson, we got, what energy modeling software would you recommend for smaller architectural firms? We mentioned Cove Tool. There's Safara as well out there that gives you some early energy modeling. And then also Passive House is it has a tool that's built in that we've even used it for larger projects. So it's those are probably some of the softwares you want to think about. Then from Guy, we have carbon is not the only reason for global warming. Can you comment on what the percentage of all things causing global warming versus carbon worries? And well, I think that's a little bit too big of a question to answer in the last few minutes. But generally buildings are shown or considered to be somewhere between, depending on how you count it, somewhere between 40 and 60% of global warming in general. And then we've got a question from Roman regarding embodied carbon becoming an increased area of focus, and has there been any LCAs done on total building review, and is it even possible with the lack of EPDs? So yes, this is a big challenge. We could, and it's important to differentiate the LCCA, the life cycle cost analysis, which we've been talking about, versus an LCA, which is life cycle analysis. Life cycle analysis, can be done on anything. But often it's referring to embodied carbon in a building, and yeah, it's growing. We've been doing them. They are now required in the Toronto Green Standard, for instance, but and you're required to do them on federal projects. But lack of EPDs are a problem. But I'm seeing more and more come up, so hopefully that's getting better. And we've got a couple of minutes left. Few more comments, but yeah, I think that's it for the questions. I don't know, Felix, is there anything else you need to do to kind of wrap up, or?
No, I think that's it. I can see no open questions in the Q&A window, so I believe we have reached the end of the presentation. Peter and Jeff, thank you so much for a great webinar, and thank you also to all our members who attended. And as we conclude this webinar, I would like to draw your attention to several important announcements. The next webinar takes place next week on March 21st, also at 11 a.m. And the title is Build Climate Smart, Preparing Canada's Built Environment for Climate Change. And as mentioned, the OAA will report your participation in this webinar to your transcript. Therefore, there's no need for individual reporting on your part. We kindly ask for your patience as we process and confirm the accreditation of your hours within the next few weeks. Additionally, all attendees will soon receive the presentation file via email along with a link to submit your feedback. Once again, thanks for your attendance and have a productive and pleasant remainder of your day. Thanks and bye-bye.
Okay, thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.